for Sustainable Development the role of voluntary sustainability standards. To be short and good, all of us, we know that for achieving the SDGs, or at least to avoid two big setbacks of SDGs, international trade can and must play an important role. The expansion of international trade has brought benefit across the globe, but at the same time, and we know it, it has also led to adverse impacts, especially on the environment and social front. This demands a profound transformation in the ways we produce and in the ways we consume. It also requires the mobilization of all communities and all tools at our disposal. In recent years, voluntary sustainability standards have emerged as a new tool to address key sustainability challenges such as biodiversity, climate change, and human rights. Today, there are more than 500 sustainability standards being used along global supply chains, covering a wide range of products and commodities. Standards can push the frontiers of best practices of sustainable production methods. They can also help to build trust in consumers and other stakeholders towards these practices. But in UNCTAD, we pay particular attention to the risks of fragmentation of VSS, which can represent a challenge, even a hurdle, for developing countries, and in particular for small producers in these countries. VSS can increase information and production costs and eventually exclude smallholders and producers in developing countries from global trade. This is the case when there is a plethora of different VSS requiring separate certification. Besides these pre-existing challenges, the COVID-19 pandemic implies further complications for developing countries, as the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic are particularly severe in these countries, and it's not the end, unfortunately. Today, we will launch the UNCTAD report, Better Trade for Sustainable Development, the Role of VSS. With this report, we want to advance the dialogue on how we can better harness sustainability standards towards the achievement of sustainable trade and SDGs. In a nutshell, this report has tried to answer the following question. What are the possibilities and limitations of VSS to make international trade more sustainable, in particular with regard to developing countries' development opportunities? What evidence do we have on the economic, social, and environmental impacts of VSS on the ground, mostly in developing countries? What are the barriers to VSS uptake specifically in developing countries, and how to overcome these barriers? And finally, what are the roles of policymakers and other stakeholders, for example, NGOs, multinational organizations, and donors, etc., in assisting in overcoming these barriers and maximizing the favorable impacts of VSS? I take this opportunity to thank the authors of this report. Before introducing the panelists, I want to mention that if you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A chat box at any time. This question will then be selected during the Q&A session after the panel discussion. So, which are our guests? So, we have with us today, without further delay, I introduce the panelists. Ms. Mercedes Arauz, former Vice President of Peru and now Professor of Economics, Universidad del Pacífico. Mr. Chad Blackman, Ambassador, Permanent Representative, Permanent Mission of Barbados to the United Nations Office at Geneva. Ms. Monica Rubiolo, Head Trade Promotion, State Secretariat for Economic Affairs for Switzerland. Mr. Axel Marx, Deputy Director in Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, University of Leuven, my compatriot. And Mr. Santiago Fernandez de Cordoba, economist in the Trade Analysis Branch in UNCTAD. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today and to hearing you insightful views of those issues. And first, we will hear from the two authors of the report, Mr. Fernandez de Cordoba and Mr. Marx, about the main findings of the Better Trade for Sustainable Development report. So just to let you know, Mr. Marx is, so I mentioned, the Deputy Director at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies in Leuven. His research focuses on global governance, sustainability standards, non-state market regulation, human rights, trade governance, among others, and he has contributed to reports for several national and international organizations, including UNCTAD and UNFSS. So Santiago Fernandez de Cordoba is an economist at UNCTAD and coordinates the work of the United Nations Forum of Sustainability Standards. He has more than 20 years experience in trade policy, particularly on market access issues, standard and structural adjustment. So over to you, Mr. Fernandez de Cordoba and Mr. Max.
Thank you, Madame Duran, for that kind introduction and for raising all those crucial issues regarding the importance of this dialogue. Indeed, we have quite a challenging picture in terms of the sustainability of our planet and the well-being in it. Madame Duran, you have reminded us of the urgency to change our production and consumption paradigm. But most importantly, you have provided us with hope to achieve a more sustainable path through better trade. Let me start my presentation. Thank you. My role today is to introduce the recently launched UNCTAD publication on this matter. I will do this together with Professor Axel Max from University of Leuven, who will speak in a bit. Let's go to the first slide. As you have mentioned, our report discusses the link between the sustainability crisis we're living, the way we trade, and how it impacts on the progress towards SDGs. Clearly, as you mentioned, we're not moving fast enough on the path to achieve the SDGs. But most importantly, the manner we pursue economic development has implications for our environment, social, and economic systems. On the environment, we probably have heard the recent conclusions of the recently launched Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, where it has revealed a clear message regarding the global warming crisis that we're living. July 2021 was the hottest month ever recorded, following us from the hottest year ever recorded, 2020, from the hottest decade ever recorded. Furthermore, forests lost are the cost of around 10% of global warming, and around 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinctions. On the social and economic concerns, decent work, labor rights, fair wages, equal opportunities are fundamental for growth and poverty reduction. Hazardous workplaces continue to exist. Another example could be a small cocoa producer who gets less than 10% of the final price of a chocolate bar. To respond to these challenges, there is need for powerful tools and instruments. Voluntary sustainability standards, or VSS as they're known, could be considered one of these market-based tools that can contribute to the transformation in global value chains. Next slide, please. The report that we're launching today analyzes the potential and constraints of VSS in making international trade more sustainable, in particular with regards to developing countries' development opportunities. But most importantly, it also looks at the evidence on the impact of VSS in the field, in particular in developing countries, with regards to the environmental, social, and economic concerns. And lastly, it presents or proposes some structural approaches that could be considered to enhance the potential of VSS in mitigating the sustainability crisis and advancing the achievements of the SDGs. We encourage you to download the publication from the UNCTAD website. Next slide, please. But what are VSS? VSS comprises certification schemes, labeling programs, and private standards. Probably most of you, when you go to your local supermarket, you've seen those labels of products that we buy daily in the supermarket. These standards cover a wide range of metrics, such as environmental impacts, community relations, land use, human rights, fair prices, and so on, and the production system behind. In a nutshell, VSS help manages the production system by allocating the consumption preferences to certain sustainability preferences of the consumers. Some characteristics: it's a seal of approval, it's an effective marketing tool, it provides sometimes a price premium, and it also provides market access. In the last decade, VSS has become an important transnational governance instrument of global value chains. And today, they are a de facto market entry condition for exports. And with regards to developing countries, what is fundamental, it links developing countries with developed countries' markets, because most of the production of the commodities that are related are in developing countries. Next slide, please. The report pays particular attention to the SDGs agenda, and it looks at how VSS can support this agenda by complementing the role of governments and international organizations. Beyond, of course, the SDG 12 of responsible consumption and production, VSS touches upon a wide range of policy targets that are also included in the SDGs. We have already mentioned a couple of them, including decent work, food security, gender equality, climate action, and many others. But what is clear and what comes from the report, for VSS to be a tool to help developing countries achieve the sustainable development goals, there's need to address some of the challenges that developing countries face in implementing voluntary sustainability standards along the global value chain. Next slide, please. And of course, as we know today, the link of VSS and trade is through global value trades. Today, trade is predominantly conducted through global value chains. About 8 trillion worth of global trade goes through value chains. And it is through global value chains that VSS are able to diffuse the social and environmental standards globally. Most importantly, it is through global value chains that negative social and environmental consequences can be addressed, hence upgrading the global sustainability process. Now, I want to turn to Professor Axel Max, which will probably share a bit of the results from the publication with regards to the uptake, effectiveness, and impact of VSS in particular. Axel, over to you.
Thank you, Santiago, and thank you, Ms. Durand, for your very kind introduction. Yes, I will focus a little bit on what we found and try to do in the report with regard specifically to voluntary sustainability standards. The main aim is actually try to capture the academic literature, the knowledge we already know about the emergence, development, and effectiveness of voluntary sustainability standards, with the main focus on effectiveness, and I will return to that in a minute. But maybe first, for you to know, what we do in the beginning of the report is to really map out the evolution in the number of voluntary sustainability standards. And as Ms. Durand said in her opening remarks, currently there are many voluntary sustainability standards operational worldwide. Depending on the database you use, the numbers differ, but there are quite a few hundreds operational today. And we see, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, a very stark increase in the number of voluntary sustainability standards. And in the report, we identify the main drivers for this increase, which include consumer demand, brand protection by companies, but also the further integration of voluntary sustainability standards in public regulation and so on. So what we now have is a large number of, let's say, voluntary sustainability standards which are used in global value chains to introduce sustainability concerns. And this is becoming what we consider in the report quite an important and notable phenomenon. Next slide, Nima. Now, given the importance of voluntary sustainability standards and their emergence over time, we try to understand in the report what do we know about the effectiveness of these standards with regard to achieving sustainable development, with regard to sustainability. And in order to understand effectiveness, we operationalize that on 2 dimensions. One is an impact dimension and the other one is the adoption dimension. And for the impact dimension, our colleague from the University of Münster, Professor Thomas Dietz, has performed a very large, let's say, meta-analysis with regard to adoption dimension. The University of Leuven has conducted research, and there we try to understand the uptake of standards. Now, with regard to these two dimensions, it's important to know that they are mutually reinforcing. If voluntary sustainability standards really want to have an impact on sustainability, they need to score on two dimensions, impact and uptake. With impact, we really look at to what degree do they contribute towards increasing income for farmers and producers? To what degree do they contribute to alleviating poverty? To what degree do they actually try to address biodiversity issues and so on? And some of these standards, and we know that from the literature, have an impact, but if they are not used widely, if they are not adopted widely, their overall effectiveness will be minimal. So that's why we try to analyze in the report these two dimensions. Next slide, Nina. With regard to the impact dimension, as I said, Professor Thomas Dietz made a very large meta-analysis of many different studies conducted in several countries, and you can see the countries from which studies were collected here on the map. And for some countries, there are many studies available on different commodities, and he tried to understand what are the overall results on the impact of voluntary sustainability standards. And our main conclusion there is that there are very, let's say, a divergent picture which is emerging. And we can find for some impact dimensions a positive impact of voluntary sustainability standards. For others, there's little or no impact if you would compare it to non-certified producers. And on certain impact dimensions, VSS have what we might call a negative impact in the sense that they might increase production costs without necessarily achieving sufficient price premiums to cover that. But these are all, let's say, findings based on specific case studies in a specific country, in a specific time frame. And that's why we actually note and highlight in the report that the results are very context specific. So for some, we find quite a bit of evidence that there is significant positive impact on different types of sustainability criteria, for others less. And of course, now the next step for us as researchers is try to understand what's happening there. Next slide, Nima. Then on adoption, we try to understand what is the impact of standards. On adoption, we use in the report different types of parameters to figure out where are VSS mostly adopted, for which commodities, in which countries, and so on. And what you see here on the map is an overview of the countries where VSS are very active, the darker green color, and where they are less active, shallow green or white. And as you can expect, to a large degree, that aligns with the income level of countries, the export of commodities of certain countries, which make them color dark green. But we also observe that even in some developing countries, there are some countries which are performing very well with regard to, let's say, the use and adoption of voluntary sustainability standards compared to others. So income levels and export profiles explain a lot, but there's still a lot of variation found in the different types of countries. And in the report, we try to highlight and understand a bit where that variation comes from. Next slide, Nima. Then when we focus on the variation, and especially to the fact that in least developed countries, we observe a larger low adoption level of VSS, we try in the report to highlight what might be some of the barriers for VSS uptake and what might be some of the barriers for producers from those countries to be integrated in global value chains. And we can return to some of the barriers in the discussion, but very briefly, we identified 4 in the report. One is the costs involved in obtaining VSS, and it's especially a problem for producers in least developed countries where they don't have enough, let's say, financial technical capacity to obtain a VSS. We know that certification, especially for certain certificates, can be quite costly if you want to comply with the standards, and some of the producers don't have them. let's say, the sufficient resources to do that. Another barrier is that there's sometimes a lack of incentives for VSS adoption. We know that there is demand for VSS certified products in certain countries, but less in other countries. And if your export markets are directed to those countries, there might be less incentives to obtain VSS. We identify what's been called in the literature a so-called governance gap, and that has mostly to do with the fact that in some least developed countries, the regulatory environment is not always conducive for developing uptake of standards, and that might actually create one of the barriers. And finally, in the literature, we also find what we can call opposition towards VSS, and that has to do with the fact that some of these VSS, or most of them, are developed in developed countries, and it's not always, let's say, the position of producers in developing countries to comply with those standards. But these are the broad 4 barriers we identified. Next slide, Nima. So in summary, we see a very strong proliferation of VSS, and in the report, we try to find what their effectiveness is in terms of uptake and impact. Next slide, Nima. And then, of course, this spills over in the final part of the report that we offer some reflections about what might be some of the implications for the policy actors in the field, or might be some of the policy implications. And there we, on several components, one is that we try to, I think that more support, either by donors or multilateral organizations, could be offered to producers, especially in these developed countries, to develop enough sufficient capacity to adopt standards. With regard to the adoption of standards, there's a lot of potential, possibly by integrating VSS in public policy, and there we touch upon how it might be integrated in trade policy, how it might be integrated in export promotion, how it might be integrated in sustainable public procurement. There are several options which actually might influence the uptake of standards. We focus on the issue which was actually addressed by Ms. Durand in her opening remarks about the fragmentation of voluntary sustainability standards and the confusion that creates on the market, not only for producers, but also for consumers, and maybe via transparency measures, better inform consumers for the uptake of standards. And then finally, we focus on strengthening empowerment, and there we focus very much on what voluntary sustainability standards might do themselves, create more impact and higher adoption. So I think that's in a nutshell what we try to achieve in the report and what we have done.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you, Santiago, for this insightful presentation. And for sure, it's important to have the most recent data or analysis on the situation, the number, more or less. We see that it's not an easy way. It's not easy to measure all those issues, but you presented very well the nuance that we have to use in order to analyze it properly, and also try to look at how we can recommend to use that as a tool. So thank you for that. And let's revert to our discutant, and let me start with Miss Mercedes Arauz. She's professor of economics in the Universidad del Pacífico, and she also served as second vice president of Peru between 2016 and 2020. And earlier to that, she served as Minister of Foreign Trade and Tourism, Minister of Production, as well as Minister of Economy and Finance. So I'm sure that she has something interesting to let us know and to enrich the discussion. So Mercedes, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ms. Durand. It's a pleasure to be here with you and comment the document, the report, which I really think is a fantastic report. It's quite focused on the needs of improving our relation with trade and the VSS. As they mentioned in the report, there are too many VSS certifications, and sometimes there is a lot of confusion, and it's costly for producers, in particular in developing countries, to achieve the certifications. The high cost or small producers is important to mention. But it's not only the high cost, it's the value added given by the certifications. So it's, as is mentioned in the document, we have to measure the extra benefit that they will receive through prices, through improvement in their livelihoods, if they want to do it. And they have to trust in the model, because remember, these mostly are poor people that are living in the day-by-day income, by the day-by-day income. So they prefer sometimes to have a collector giving them a low price in the short term, but they have the money immediately, instead of having a long-term contract in which the process takes time and the money is not coming immediately to them. So this is an issue I think we have to focus a lot. So I think, for example, that harmonization of some of these VSS and certifications will help. Companies which I interviewed told me that they really believe some of this certifications are very good and are very simple and easy to use for small farmers, for example. But the communication is important, and they have an impact when they are used. Definitely, they believe in the impact of using these certifications like Global Gap, Rainforest Alliance, Smith, recently Spring, for example, for the use of water. So some of these are important for them because they have a real impact and use. But we have to move forward so we make sure small farmers get involved. Also, an issue that is important to think about is market access. Market access could be reduced. WTO will be focused on market access and not differences between among countries. So we have to make sure that these VSS don't turn into market access barriers. For example, I will use an example that some of the farmers were talking that I interviewed were telling me that, for example, in terms of having the reduction of some chemicals in the use of some chemicals, we can see that some chemicals are not damaging anyone, and we have the FDA giving a given number, so it's okay for FDA in the US to have the entrance of some products with that amount of chemicals. But some firms, some buyers will say, no, it's not enough. I will use the idea of having less chemicals, for example, or of a particular chemical that is not dangerous or have some hazard, to promote and use it as a marketing tool to tell to my consumers, okay, use it. We have less chemicals than anyone else. But then you're reducing the possibilities of many small farmers that are given the products using in an adequate way those chemicals, but because of these marketing tools, they are excluding them. So we have to reduce that risk to exclude people because we want to use VSS as a marketing tool only, not really because you care about the people that are consuming those goods. Also, as I mentioned, that also will reduce the possibility of concentration of markets. Are we using this VSS not only for international trade? Are we using it inside our local markets? We have to make sure that we have equivalent treatment in those markets when we are using that. You know, there are very good examples that in my country are being using not only in agriculture. I will mention that also in areas like fishery, which is very important. In Peru, for example, the industry association are moving ahead, pushing a lot of these VSS. Basically, they are working much better with the social and economic issues than with environmental issues, but they are using it. And the document that was presented by the two panelists, the two authors I mentioned, they show that mainly we see more results that are good in social and economic issues than in the environmental part. So we have to be careful on that. And I mentioned that in the fishery sector, they already said themselves that they have to push forward the issues on environmental management. The other area in which we are exporters is mining. Mining has a lot of problems, particularly with small producers and artisan mining people, particularly with gold. Gold is a very dangerous area because they use, for example, mercury to collect gold from the water ponds, and that's very dangerous. But mining should be one of the sectors I think we have to focus a lot so we can reduce the environmental impact and really help these people, particularly in the Amazon basin, in which they're having the environmental impact, dangerous environmental impact, and also a lot of social problems with these informal mining areas. Agriculture, of course, part of our agriculture is for exports, and we have been quite successful with that. But as I mentioned, there's a space for more work. I will mention an interesting case, a banana, organic banana, in which small farmers were associated with the support of the government and the support of some NGOs like Solidarity and Innovate Peru, which is a program that we have in our country. So 100% of the producers already have a organic certification, for example. They have 60% of the associated producers, they have some kind of a good democratic structure to work together, and they also receive fair trade or just fair trade certification. They also have global gap. 95% of them, they have global gap. And or they already working and increasing their income in real ways, because before they were all fragmented and receiving a very low price, but now they are receiving the fair price and at the same time improve. They went from, like in 20 years, they went from almost $300,000 of income, and now they are like producing $125 million altogether, working in this kind of association. So that's very helpful. We can show good examples in which these contracts and these certifications really can help, but we have to have the government involved. And I don't want to take all the time, but I will make some comments on what is needed in terms of governance. Governance is a very important issue that was mentioned, and I think governance needs not only producers to be involved. Producers should be involved in the making of these certifications and the evaluation of these certifications, because if producers are not there, they're gonna be they will be subject to the monopolistic power of buyers, and we don't want that. We want really to have their voice involved, and in particular in developing countries, so we can see the reality that they have, the local conditions that they have. Sometimes they don't have the good infrastructure for managing their products, like the cold chain to manage the fruits and veggies, for example, in the way they are. So we have to see what is going on. We have to see also what are the conditions of the financial sector. Are they involved? Do they have the possibilities to be involved and to have inclusion in the financial sector? Sometimes they don't. And the governments should be also involved in that sense, because governments have a role, an important role. And I think governments, as was mentioned, donors and the multilateral sectors should be looking at things like technical capabilities for small farmers, so they can really achieve these standards. Financial inclusion, because if they have financial inclusion, for sure they will be able to manage the issues of long-term, short-term, and have, of course, the possibility of being paid on time when they need the resources, the money to produce and capitalize themselves. Also, we have to make sure that they believe in the contracts. And the document was very clear. If they don't have good state of law. I mean, if they don't have the clarity that they can trust the contracts, there won't be no commitment. As I mentioned, they would prefer the gatherers that would pay them in short term. So it's very important that the governments should improve the possibilities that there is no informality in the market. Peru is a very interesting case in which, after the pandemic particularly, we grew from 70% of informality in our markets to 80%. It's so dangerous to have so much informality, because informality could damage all the VSS process through the value chain. Another issue that is very important is education. Some interesting cases are coming from education to children. So they believe and values are involved in our VSS. If we work with children in the schools, telling how important it is to protect the environment, to take care of these social issues and economic issues, and also to believe in, have trust in our partners. When we talk, we have a value in terms of our voice, and telling them that if we are promising something, our promise is an important promise that we have to achieve. This is important. So children also educates the parents. So it's an important way to address issues of trust in our countries. But I will say, I don't want to take all the time, is that governments can participate all together, particularly in developing countries, when to have the ability to negotiate what are the standards that can be achievable by our countries. So I think we can work together, particularly, for example, in Latin America. I would say the countries like Chile, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, that maybe Brazil, we can work together to find which are the standards that can be achievable and possible to address in the short term, medium term, and long term. So that's possibilities of working with a nice negotiation. We work all together in these negotiations. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Mercedes, for this really interesting issues related to, and I remember two important words: trust, which is key, trust in the system; market concentration or market access, which of course is key; and governance, which are of course the third pillar of what you just said. So, but thank you for that, because it was really helpful with examples of your country. Thank you. So now over to you, Ambassador Blackman. I introduce you, of course, as the ambassador and PR of the mission of Barbados to the United Nations office at Geneva. You have worked in the international development sector for over 15 years. You are the chair of the Trade and Environment Committee in the WTO. So that's interesting, because we know that for the VSS, the problem is maybe also the environment impact. And so I will give you the floor, and I insist on the fact that you are also, for us in UNCTAD, chair the CITES group in the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and it's true that CITES are also very specific in this regard. So you have the floor, Ambassador Blackman.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Good afternoon or good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. Just as a matter of clarification, I'm actually the outgoing chair for Trade and Environment in WTO. Putting it into perspective, the concept of course of sustainability is one in which it has now become mainstream in development architecture circles. And whilst it may mean different things to different countries, it certainly has served to unite the diverse interests amongst the members of the UN. Now, the role of voluntary sustainability standards, in my view, has often come up as an instrument for delivering one or more sustainable trade, and as a prerequisite for integration into global trade and global value chains. Now, the impact of climate change on SIDS and its many accompaniments have added to the urgency for these vulnerable countries to move towards more sustainable trade and be the advocates for others as well. This, coupled with the commitments made at the international level, including the Paris Agreement in 2015 and the future commitments in other international fora, will be necessary if we're to have any hope of a future for Caribbean and other SIDS. Now, I would like to thank the panelists and also my fellow discussant for their interesting views exposed hitherto. UNCTAD members are currently preparing for the UNCTAD 15 Ministerial. The issue of sustainable trade and voluntary sustainability standards fits well within the theme from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity for all, as these are amongst some of the issues that have been raised in the negotiations amongst member states. I would therefore like to commend the UNCTAD Secretariat for organizing this very timely webinar and also for the report. Small island developing states continue to be challenged by small size, both in terms of their production capacity as well as physically. SIDS also depend on limited number of sectors for revenue. And of course, we've seen over the last year and a half the exposure that has caused with regards to the pandemic that we're currently facing. The most common is tourism. Their dependence on which was brought to the fore, as I said, given to the pandemic causing great exposure to the sector. SIDS are oftentimes uncompetitive given the higher per capita unit costs. This, coupled with the additional costs associated with voluntary standards, could drive up the costs for SIDS even higher, particularly for micro, small, and medium enterprises. These characteristics have often limited SIDS from linking into international value chains, as well as from being able to maintain or expand their trade into new export markets. The Secretariat's report would have drawn reference to St. Vincent and the Grenadines and voluntary sustainability standards in the area of bananas. CARICOM SIDS have, however, sought in more recent times to strengthen trade-related quality infrastructure, develop trade capacity in order to enable sustainability standards, as well as associated conformity assessment modalities. There is a growing realization that the VSS can be a tool not only for sustainable trade, but also, and importantly, for accessing new markets and tapping into niche segments of the market. The tourism sector, of course, is one of these. The management of global standards for sustainable travel and tourism and international accreditation for sustainable tourism certification has been the main task of the Global Sustainable Tourism Council and has been viewed as a benchmark for sustainable tourism for various Caribbean SIDS. As such, in light of the costs and other regulatory challenges which must be fulfilled in meeting the requirements for the VSS, it is therefore very clear that governments will need to play a critical role, as we've heard before, in building capacity of local firms to meet the VSS, as well as to develop its own standards. Developed countries seeking to mandate the use of these standards also have a role to play. And I really want to echo what was said by one of our panelists, is that VSS really should not be used or disguised as a barrier. Many countries are continuing to raise this issue, particularly many in the developing world. And therefore, we have to be very careful that once we're trying to achieve the standards, that it doesn't cause any unintended consequence. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Blackman. And it was important to look at this question through the lens of the SIDS, which is a specific market situation. And also thank you to remind to all of us the importance of UNCTAD 15 and how VSS will take place as a tool in the question of transformation of trade for prosperity and fight against inequality. So I turn finally to our last speaker, Madame Rubiolo, and you are, of course, the head of Trade Promotion, State Secretariat for Economic Affairs for Switzerland. And if you allow me, I will insist on one aspect regarding the timing. I would like to ask you specifically how the new free trade agreement between EFTA and Indonesia, which contains, it appears, some interesting innovation and with lower tariff to palm oil-based products which are certified by recognized VSS compared to other, if it can help as a tool just to go straight in the in what you can bring to this discussion. Thank you for that, Madame Riviere, and apologize for this managing very authoritarian.
Not at all. Thank you, Ms. Duran, and thank you to the organizers for the inviting to the panel. So it's a pleasure, and apologies for the technical issues we had at the beginning to join. It's really a pleasure, and I would try to go straight forward to the point on the IFTA agreement with Indonesia. If you allow me just to make one point regarding to the evolution of our involvement with voluntary sustainability standards and the link to the report, which I really think it makes is a clear contribution toward advancing the discussion, which is ongoing. And as Ms. Arauz was saying, is something that there are many issues and many challenges that we need to tackle. But let me just mention 3 of them which are important. The issue of transparency is one that was mentioned, and this is something where we need to make sure that the evidence that is available on what the voluntary sustainability standards are reaching and are not reaching, what is the impact, what are the supposed positive externalities we want to achieve, and what are we really getting on the ground, that this is communicated more transparently. And this is something that I think we are working together on that. It is the platform Evidencia that has been developed by ICIL, but where also institutions like UNCTAD and UNFSS are contributing to, with a lot of good information that we need to convey to consumers, to producers, buyers, and sellers around the voluntary sustainability standards. The second point is collaboration, because as Ms. Arauz was mentioning, we have a number of standards. There are issues about potential duplication, overlap, sharing of information, and for this, the collaboration between the standards is extremely important, and we need to foster that, perhaps push also the standards a bit more towards collaboration. Mercedes was mentioned the case of gold, and this is one area where we are working. We are working with a Better Gold initiative in the country, in his country, in Peru, but we are trying to push the standards working on gold to work and cooperate in order to share information. And the third issue relates to credibility. So how can we push innovation in the standards in order for them to not stay just 10 years ago, how the mark was, but really look to the future and to what consumers and buyers are looking for. And now making the bridge to the point you were asking me to talk about, which is about the CIPA agreement with Indonesia. Definitely, this is one area where we have been made quite an important step also internationally, and we are very keen to see how other players react to the role that now sustainability standards play in this particular free trade agreement between IFTA countries and Indonesia. And the reason for doing that step, so just to recall what we have done, is basically to define a number of criteria and elements that need to be fulfilled by the production of palm oil in order to be imported with specific differential conditions and with more advantage. And this, what we have done as a second step is to benchmark the different voluntary sustainability standards towards these criteria, so that we can see what are the standards that are fulfilling already the expectations in terms of environmental and social aspects. And the reason why we have done that is because of the strong expectation and strong pressure also from Swiss citizens with regard to the very wide discussion nationwide on sustainability in a specific sector. And I think if you were here in Switzerland in the month before the discussion, we have a very open and transparent system in Switzerland. So that means the citizens can can discuss free trade agreements. That was the case. So we voted for the free trade agreement and it was approved. But if it was approved, was because of the requirements that were put in this agreement with regard to sustainability aspects in the palm oil production. So definitely, I think that this is, as we observe the trend now, so we see quite a discussion in Switzerland, but also beyond. We are also observing that the same discussions or similar discussions are taking place in other European countries. So there are clear expectations from consumers with regard to the products, and the voluntary sustainability standards provide a strong tool in order to inform the consumers, to inform the buyers of what are the positive externalities of in the production of a specific commodity. So clearly, I think that if we look back, probably this agreement would have not passed without these provisions on sustainability. And I think this is something quite a new development. So I hope that that this subject will be discussed at some point in the WTO circle, since the MC15, as you say, is in the preparation, and there are discussions ongoing with regard to climate issues in particular, but perhaps this can be widened at some point also to include social issues, because we see clearly a trend for giving more importance to sustainability standards. So I will stop there. Glad to.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Rubiolo, for that. Because the time is running, I would like to ask to each of the other panelists, in one word, how could you summarize the recommendation, or where you would like to really pay attention very briefly in one sentence, and then we will try to conclude. I will not repeat all what was said, but I think it's important that you could react. So, Axel, do you want to add something, having heard Madame Arauz, Mr. Blackman, and Madame Rubiolo?
Yes, well, maybe if I have to do it in one word, I would mention collaboration. You mentioned in the beginning the problem of fragmentation. Bassett has also highlighted this issue. It came back in several presentations. I think it's crucial that within the world of voluntary sustainability standards, there will be more collaboration to address fragmentation. I think that will benefit the producers and that will benefit the consumers.
Thank you, Axel. Collaboration. Mr. Blackman.
Yes, I'd simply say similarly, but from a different perspective, harmonization of approach. And I think once we can have that, we will actually achieve all of the objectives under the umbrella.
Thank you, Ambassador Blackman. Mercedes? Ms. Arauz, you are with us?
Basically, fairness. I think we have to include more people in this process. So I think small farmers, small and artisan gold diggers should be included in a fair way.
Thank you. So, just not to conclude, but I think that a lot of things related to, of course, collaboration, transparency, fairness, but also market access, market concentration, and also the question of sustainability, and not only social impact, but also environmental impact. And we know how important it is. I would like that those words and all this expertise could be used by all of us in the different places where we can advocate. And the next months will be really important. First of all, UNCTAD 15, of course, on trade and development. But just after, we will have also the WTO ministerial meeting. We will have the COP26, and in between the biodiversity COP. So I think that the momentum in the next 6 months or the next year is so important to take good decision regarding also what will happen with the pandemic. And unfortunately, I think that it's not a good evolution, especially in the developing world. So it indicates so well that we have to adapt or to change or to transform our way to trade and our way to consume. So I hope that this panel, and especially the interesting contribution of the report of course, but also of the panelists commenting it, could be useful for all of you, whoever you are, an NGO, a company, a member of government, or a UN, or whatever you are doing in this regard. I think that we have to have all that in mind in order to help or to give the tone for good decision in this regard. And I think that it's the best conclusion that we could, because it's a responsibility that we have to share, all of us, and trying to lobby or to advocate on a good way in order to use properly those standards for sustainability, and especially for the developing of SDGs. So thank you to all of you. Thank you for that. Please download the report, and don't hesitate to take contact with UNCTAD in order to have many information or link with the panelists. We will, of course, help you to have a direct access. So thank you for that, and see you soon.